Undoubtedly, our application will need to access external resources that require some means of connection. Usually that's defined in a connection string. Now, the most obvious example of this is a connection string to a database. When we created our new project and we said we wanted to add individual accounts, automatically generated for us was a connection string to a fictitious, at that point, fictitious database called ASP.NET Second Project and then this GUID number after it, right? And so then the first time we called update database, the Entity Framework Code First Migration saw that we didn't have a database with that name, and it went out and created that database for us on our local DB at this server location right here. And since we are the admin for this computer and this connection was trusted, as you can see that value there, we didn't need to supply username and password. Went ahead and created that database and then began to populate it with tables and columns and things of that nature. But this connection string is really the key to that. And whenever we take this application and we want to push it up to Azure or some other hosting account, undoubtedly we're going to need to change that connection string because we are going to be accessing a different database. The local DB is just meant for local development on my local computer. When I push my application into a production environment, I'm going to want to use like Azure SQL, or if our hosting company offers SQL Server hosting, we'll probably get some connection information from there. But all of that's stored by default into this app settings.json. Now, we're talking exclusively in terms of connection strings to databases, but this can apply to a lot of different things. We may have connection strings to external resources. For example, if I want to send an email using a third-party API and third-party hosts like SendGrid, for example, which I use extensively for my web application development. They're going to give me an API key, and I'm going to need to store that somewhere. And then whenever I make a call into the SendGrid API, I need to send along that key to authenticate that, hey, yeah, that's okay. That's really me making that call into SendGrid. If I want to use a caching service like Redis Cache out on Azure, I'm going to need to give it a connection string. I may need to have, like here, you got logging information. This gives some details on the scope and the level of logging that we want to enable. So all of these are called configuration settings. By default, there is an app settings.json where we can put that information, but that's not the only place we can put that information. Furthermore, we can programmatically decide where we want to potentially pull our connection information, our configuration information from. And so there's this whole new configuration system inside of ASP.NET MVC Core. I think it's just part of .NET Core in general that allows you to pull configuration information from a bunch of different places, including JSON-style configurations, XML configurations, INI configurations, environment variables that are set on the operating system, and there may be a dozen different places. The registry, Windows registry. If you have an application and in the past you've used the Windows registry to store application settings, you can get to them through this new system. I'm just going to point out where that's actually performed and how you get at that connection string information in this video. Later on we can go into and get deeper on that in another micro course. So if you take a look at the startup.cs at near the very top here under the configure services method, under the startup constructor, you can see that there is this configuration builder object, and we start setting attributes of that object using these helper methods. And for one thing, you can see here this add JSON file method will look for a app settings.json file and we'll load those settings. But then we also, on top of that, want to load a app settings.environment name.json. So if I had defined an environment name development or environment.production, those settings would supersede the ones that I'm pulling from app settings. I could add more of these. In fact, let's just see, let's get some IntelliSense here. Environment variables, in-memory collection, user secrets. We'll devote a whole micro course to user secrets. File providers if we want to use like an INI file. So there's several different tools. Oh, it looks like we can add application insight settings. Well, I didn't know that. Okay, interesting. Several different tools inside this configuration builder that we can use to actually load in configuration settings. Now we have them available to us, and we're able to use them in the rest of our application. So let me take a quick look in the data folder at our application DB context. And actually, no, it's not there. It's back here in the configuration services method. You can see one of the lines here that we're doing is setting up our DB context as a service, which we'll talk about in the next video. We'll talk about dependency injection. And as we're creating a new instance of this DB context and making it available to all of our controllers, notice that we set options like where to grab this connection string. So we're going to the configuration object, which, as you can see, was configured up here, and saying, get me a connection string called default connection. Now it's going to look through all the different areas where a default connection would be potentially set. Now we only have it in one file here, but if we had it set in 5 different files, the last one in would kind of cover up, kind of like how CSS works, right? And so it would look through all the different sources, but ultimately in the order in which we've defined where to look for those sources, and then give me back a default connection and that we can use to configure the DB context, which needs to know which database do you want me to talk to, right? So we got to give it a connection string. And so if we look back in app settings and say, oh yeah, I see where the connection strings are. That's being used by my DB context, and here, yes, there's a default connection, and then it gives it the string, and then the entity framework knows how to use that to connect to our specific database. Okay. So I don't want to say any more than that, but that's how we acquire connection string information or any kind of settings, and then use them inside of our application through the configuration builder and the configuration object. Okay, so let's pick it up next and talk about dependency injection. That's another new piece that wasn't available in ASP.NET MVC 5, and we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks.